this is Dan Ferrisi, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Integrator and host of the AV Plus podcast, welcoming you to AV Plus, the podcast for the commercial AV integration industry. We have a very interesting topic on deck today. Right now, people are still talking quite a bit about the Great Resignation and people's great resets. We want to talk about how people can maybe change jobs or approach new opportunities while still maintaining good relationships with existing former employers and existing alliances so that nobody leaves a job or leaves a career opportunity feeling as though they've burned bridges or they've harmed themselves in terms of their overall career trajectory. It's a really important thing to bear in mind at this time when there is a lot of movement within personnel circles in commercial AV. And we have two people here today who I think can give, through their personal anecdotes, some generalizable lessons for everyone. We're really excited to have this episode of the AV Plus podcast this week, and we can't wait to share this conversation with you.
As always, please like and subscribe to our YouTube page, and please subscribe to the AV Plus podcast on Apple and on Spotify.
So happy to be joined by Dan Gundry, who is Vice President and Managing Director of VuWall USA with VuWall, and Angela Nolan, who is CEO of Vistacom. Dan, Angela, thank you for being on the AV Plus podcast today. Really appreciate your involvement with these podcast initiatives on behalf of Commercial Integrator and sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
So as I said at the outset in the introduction, we are going to be talking a little bit about kind of a personal story, your own engagement with each other, and Dan formerly having been a longtime employee of Vistacom. So we're going to be talking a little bit about, kind of in microcosm, one of these personal great resets, in this case, Dan's. But we think that the conversation is going to be very much generalizable. There'll be nuggets that our audience can take out and learn from and reflect on. So that is the goal. Dan, do you just kind of want to tee things up by talking about exactly what we're talking about here today, the idea that you were a longtime Vistacom employee, had a very, very successful run there, and then you wanted to do what I think you called your personal great reset, and then we'll dive into it from there.
Yeah, the last thing that most former employees want to do is get on a podcast with their former employer, for sure. So no, the more that I've talked about and shared my story outwards within the community and beyond the community, the more that Angela and I have talked about, the whole process, we definitely felt that there were things there that could be shared. I think we did it a pretty good way. Probably, I feel differently about it slightly than Angela does, and I think that's okay. But ultimately, 20 years at Vistacom, an organization that treated me very well, gave me great opportunities to do things that I could and could not imagine over those years. When I finally made the decision that I was ready for my next challenge and that it was not going to be at Vistacom, it needed to be deliberate because I had relationships there, friendships there. I had built my business working for Vistacom, so I needed to make sure that I did it the right way. And that's part of the story that I wanted to share today, Dan. Obviously, Angela has the other side of that story that I hope that she'll be able to share with everybody. And at the end of it, to your point from earlier, that there are some takeaways that anybody and everybody who's listening can take back and internalize and apply either in their current situations or future situations so that they, one, don't burn bridges unnecessarily so, to reflect on and consider all, perspectives in a separation of any kind. And 3, look to the positives and look to the future. And the future is a combined future, both in terms of, employee, and employer.
Absolutely. And Angela, I just wanted to introduce you briefly. Obviously, you are the CEO of Vistacom. Vistacom was named just recently our Integrator of the Year. So it's a very well-run and very successful organization. I believe in the last 2 years, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've essentially doubled in size just in terms of that double-digit growth year after year. So it's a very strong and successful integrator. Do you want to just give our audience who may be a little bit less familiar with Vistacom than I am a very quick top-level view of what the integrator is and what it has achieved?
Sure. First, we're very thankful and proud of the honor that you bestowed upon us to be Integrator of the Year. It's been really an interesting ride over the last couple of years. We've been around as a company since 1954, so there's a lot of longevity, but the last couple of years have really skyrocketed our growth. A couple different reasons for that. Just before I go into that, you wanted to give a little background. We are an East Coast integrator located in Allentown, Pennsylvania. For many years, we were, an integrator who was around the, $20 million mark with 60 to 70 employees. That was kind of our sweet spot for a long time as a company. Over the last few years, we've had some initiatives within the company that have really helped to spearhead our growth. And a lot of the things that have come out of COVID regarding technology needs that are now becoming more forefront in our customers' minds have really also helped to spearhead our growth. And we have had more than doubled our company over the last 2 years. And we now have about 95 employees as a company as well. And Dan, the division that Dan ran in the control room market was one of the key pieces that helped spearhead our growth.
Absolutely. And I know that, Dan, you played a pivotal role, as Angela just said, in the success of that command and control segment of Vistacom's business. So before we get into what your reasoning was about pursuing that new opportunity, that personal great reset, do you want to talk a little bit about your career trajectory within Vistacom, some of what you have achieved there, and some of what made it a very rewarding, many-year career within the Vistacom organization?
Before I started at Vistacom, I was a construction manager. So I worked on large construction projects and I built buildings. And what I loved about that was knowing that we had a challenge out in front of us. We could build something at the end of it. We could look and say, I built that, and then move on to the next one. And I've been very blessed working at Vistacom when I made the move over into the technology field to kind of reinvent myself a few different times and build different aspects of the business. It started off by building a bid desk practice during those days where that was really important to us to help show value to consultants, engineers, architects, construction managers, and they were our audience that we were selling to. We built that into a very profitable and a very large side of the business at the time. Around the peak of that, Angela said, hey, we're arguably paying our best sales rep to do our lowest margin work. Something doesn't compute there. And so she recruited me into this command and control side of our business at the time that had a really good foundation that we built upon. And we've been to Angela's point, very successful with that over the years. We built it into what I believe to be arguably, whether I'm inside the Vistacom organization or outside now, looking in one of the top 2 or 3 control room integrators in the US. Very proud of that achievement, very proud of Vistacom. At the same time, now after 20 years, I was looking for that next challenge, that next good foundation to really take to hopefully make great. And I saw that here. The reason for me leaving had absolutely nothing to do with Vistacom. It really had to do with Dan's next challenge.
One thing I want to talk about is when you have a very successful multiple year partnership between employer and employee, I think sometimes kind of a homeostasis, for lack of a better word, can set in where there may not be a whole lot of communication back and forth. It's just like people have their rhythm, they know what they're doing, they're succeeding on all fronts. But do you want to talk a little bit about the importance of both employers and employees not taking each other for granted, making sure you're moving together in the same direction? And this is open both to you, Dan, and to you, Angela, from your respective perspectives. The idea that someone might be with your company for 10 or 20 years, as was the case with me with Sound and Communications, and you get comfortable and you may not be dialoguing as much as you once were. Is it important to have, kind of a temperature check, so to speak, and say, are we moving in the same direction?
Yeah, I think so. I wouldn't categorize anything, the relationship with Angela and I as anything like that. We talked very regularly. Some might actually say too much, but we stayed in constant contact I do think though that the conversations maybe are different. They're more about the business as opposed to, you know, what feeds you, what you need from me. The employee side of that, you do tend to get on cruise control, and it is the one thing that we all need to take, lock, stock, and barrel in to make sure that we're staying on top of it. But I would never categorize the relationship as such. It was never dismissive or absent by any stretch, but you can get complacent, to your point, Dan, in any kind of relationship, in any kind of environment. And, you know, that is definitely a lesson to be taken seriously.
What do you think about that, Angela? The idea of kind of a homeostasis of some kind developing after a decade or two?
Yeah, I do think it's an important point to get across to the audience because, you know, in hindsight, this was the one takeaway that I had, that I want to make sure that I actively think about other employees that are critical here at Vistacom and make sure that, you know, I'm having those conversations with them about, you know, making sure that our goals are aligned, that you know, where they see their career going is the same place that we see their career going. Because you do get to the point, I mean, Dan and I had a real rhythm where, you know, we really, you know, didn't really need to say a lot to get across what we wanted to get done, right? We knew exactly how each other worked, and you kind of really get into that rhythm. But I didn't necessarily take the time to look at, you know, the long range goals of the employee, in this case Dan, versus the long range goals of our company, to make sure that they were aligned. And that's really important, because if they're not, you know, it's not going to work for anybody. You know, even, you know, with Dan being there 20 years, I don't want him to stay stagnant in a job that doesn't challenge him if that's really not where he sees himself going. And that's how I feel about any employee that's here. And I believe most employers feel as well, that it's, you know, it's really important to kind of just take those touch point moments to make sure that you really are on the same page.
Now, Dan, you've taken pains throughout the 10 minutes or so we've spoken so far to emphasize that you left Vistacom on very good terms. I mean, obviously, Angela is here with us. We're having this conversation. So this is not in any way a bad breakup. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's a very productive breakup where we feel all of us can learn a little bit about how to go in a different direction in a positive way where no bridges are ever burned. That being said, my sense is, you know, you've talked about a personal great reset or your own new challenges, that there were reasons for you to pursue this opportunity elsewhere. What were those reasons? Do you want to give us some insight into what your mindset was when you said, you know what, I'm going to pull the trigger and do this?
Yeah, so there's no gun to my head right now. I'm not reading for scripts. No, the reasons were varied. It was all about, you know, the next challenge for me. As I said, I really like to build business units. When I look at my career trajectory, the things that I want to do next, this is a stepping stone to what I ultimately want to do with my career in the, you know, however many years I've got left to do this job. I'm older than probably, hopefully, some people think. But, you know, there are things that I want to do with my career. You know, Vistacom's a family-owned business. You know, those are some things I may not always have the ability to. Angela's a phenomenal CEO. If I ever wanted to be a CEO one day, those are going to be limited while she's still around. So those are some of the reasons. But realistically, we left Vistacom Control Room Solutions, the control room side of the business, in extremely capable hands. I checked off a lot of the boxes that I wanted to do there that fed me and fed that challenge of building something from good to great. And I'm very, very proud of the team that I have there. It was one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult decision I had to make to say goodbye. And I mean that with all of my heart and mind. It was not done absolutely. And I know that this is Dan's personal story, but hopefully there are other people out there that take some of that away. The reasons for leaving may be varied. But you know, it was a decision that I knew that I had to make. Otherwise, it may have changed the relationship at Vistacom. You know, if I did not have those things that fed me in terms of wanting to build. So those were, you know, some of the more personal reasons. You know, I think I've stressed it a couple of times here. It was not anything negative going on at the office. Quite frankly, I still get looks of people being dumbfounded when I let them know that I've left Vistacom, because they're like, "What?" I'm like, "No, it's not them, it's me."
So given you've given us some visibility now into your reasoning, can you bring us to some extent into the room, and it can either be you, Dan, or you, Angela, that conversation that you had, and knowing that you respect each other as much as you do, and you did have a good, strong communicative relationship in the decades prior. How is this conversation done? And I think this is one of those ways that we can generalize what we're talking about from the specific to something that everyone can learn from and glean something from. As I say, if we're all on this podcast together, that is a clear testament to the fact that this is not a bridge burn. This is a good relationship. How do you have that difficult conversation? Because I know if it was me, my heart might be beating a little bit. Like, how am I going to say this?
Well, Angel, let me tee it up, and then you can, because I can start off, because I planned the conversation, and then you can probably talk about your reaction to it. So here's the message that I'll tell people is: one, think it through, make sure that it checks off all of your boxes and it is something you want to do, and then be intentional about what that step is. Regardless of whether you do decide to leave for a bad reason or just to a great new opportunity, as I have here, make sure that it's for your right reasons, and then make sure that you put your plan in place to not just make the conversation and have the announcement, which I did, and put it together in a formal letter to Angela, but also to walk her through it, and make sure that I've given the appropriate amount of time that I believe to the company in order to transition, all of my responsibilities and relationships accordingly. And up until that point, up until me going in and sitting down and having that conversation, first of all, always do it on a Friday afternoon. Just like when you fire somebody, always do your separation on Friday afternoon. I'm sure that Angela had a great weekend afterwards, I'm sure. But no, went in, we had a conversation. It was during our normal one-on-ones, which we talked about a little bit earlier in terms of regular communication. I usually let Angela get through her agenda beforehand. And, I said, I just have one thing to talk about, and handed her the letter. And up until that point, it was all about me. It was Dan being very selfish. It was. But the trigger changed in my head after I gave my notice and Angela eventually accepted it, that it became all about Vistacom. It was all about those last 4 weeks in this case of doing everything that I could to make that transition as good and solid and detailed as possible, so that, when I left, while I knew that my name would be said in vain many, many, many times, I'm sure, that I had at least felt that, I lessened the blow as much as possible and did everything I could. Anyways, that's my side of that day, that conversation. I don't know if Angela wants to comment further.
Sure. So that's kind of was the beginning of the exit strategy there, and everything happened exactly the way Dan said. And I did appreciate that a couple different things. First, that I really left our conversation with, a few days to kind of digest how I wanted to handle it, how I wanted to communicate it, and how I wanted to plan out, Dan's exit strategy from Vistacom. I really appreciated that Dan and I worked through that together. So the communication strategy was on, my timetable with how first internally and then externally. Dan worked with me on how we wanted that message to be sent, and how we wanted to communicate to some of our key vendors and clients as well. So that was really important in the whole layout of how we handled everything. And the fact that, when you're in a key role with any company, I think it's really important that you give that employer the respect to have enough time to exit in a way that doesn't leave the company in a lurch. Dan gave us, it was about 5 weeks, which was plenty of time to do everything that we needed to do to make sure that we didn't jeopardize anything with the company. So I really appreciate that as well. I will put a little caveat out there. I think one of the reasons that this worked really well was that Dan did not go to a competitor. none of these strategies are going to work if an employee leaves for a competitor. That's a very different scenario and much more difficult to navigate through successfully. But going to a vendor, this was definitely a move that we did not consider, in any way adversarial to Vistacom. One of the things that was really great, Dan actually was part of vetting out replacements for his position. I actually called him multiple times to kind of bounce off some ideas with him. And, I will say that the person that took over Dan's role, Rob Schlegel, was somebody that Dan and I had talked about together. And it's been a great transition. Dan's actually been part of it, had multiple conversations with Rob, and we're real excited to have Rob in the role. He's doing great. I think it's going to be a great new chapter for Vistacom. And interesting enough, he and Dan and Rob are working well together. So that really helped kind of not have a period of where there was a big hole in understanding where Vistacom was going with their control room team. It's really been that upward trajectory hasn't really wavered with the way that everything was set up.
And Dan, to chime in and add on to what Angela said, you're right. It wouldn't work if I had gone to a competitor. That'd be very different circumstances. I do still think as an employee, if I'm putting any words of advice out there for people that do decide to go to a competitor, even, there's still a right way or a better way to do it. Because at the end of the day, I think it's your reputation that's intact regardless of how you're leaving. So again, regardless of your rationale, regardless of where you're going, to do it properly so that you can look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day, but also that your reputation is intact moving forward. It's a small industry. We all know each other for the most part. And you want to make sure that that you in your own mind have it that you're going for the right reasons, and B, that you're able to say that my reputation is intact at the end of it.
That is critically important because this is a very small industry and people do talk and you see the same names and faces, even if the affiliations on the business cards or the LinkedIn profiles change. So one's reputation is the most valuable thing one really can have, because that is going to get that person in the door in the future. I think we've already gotten a lot of good ideas as far as how to navigate those conversations and make sure it's productive and make sure it's not adversarial. What about a little bit more about kind of transition planning to maintain company strength? And that's something both of you touched on. Are there any more specifics either of you might want to share as far as what our audience could think about? Say, someone in our audience is getting ready to move on. They want to help their employer build a transition plan or be as helpful as possible in making that transition happen. Are there any action items or tips and tricks you might want to put forth to say, this is a way that we did it successfully?
On the sale, again, I was mostly in a role of sales and some leadership as well. So I think there's a couple of quick, easy bullets that you can put down there. One is notes, whether it's account notes, whether if you manage people, it's, updating some HR profiles and or sending notes about them. Ultimately, anybody who replaces, a person who's managing somebody should take their time to get to know the employee themselves, as opposed to just taking my word for it, for instance. But those notes can be helpful to at least, informing any kind of new manager coming in. If you're an account manager or something like that, notes on, your accounts that you're working on, activity, what have you. I think to Angela kind of alluded to it, the timing of communications really was multi-layered. It was, hey, how do we announce this to other managers within the organization? I timed part of my exit in advance of strategic planning sessions that Vistacom was going through, right? What are the next, 12 months, 24 months, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years look like for Vistacom? I knew that I was leaving, so I wanted to make sure that they all knew about that before that, as opposed to going in with an assumption that I would be part of it. That was fair and reasonable, I believe. But when do you tell those managers? When do you tell your immediate staff? When do you communicate out to key vendors and key customers? The other thing too about that is, over the years, because I was such the front man for a lot of the business to that point, Angela would, I think, admit she didn't have the same level of relationships that she probably now has with some of those key clients and vendors, because I was, really in charge of a lot of those. So notifying them, passing the baton, making the introductions, making sure that they knew why I was leaving and why I wasn't leaving. We did not want to give the perception that there was anything wrong, because there wasn't. It was not about Vistacom. It was solely about Dan. So I think those are some of the things I would leave, Dan, which is make sure your notes and communications are good. Again, I turned off the selfish button in my brain at that point and tried to make it as much about Vistacom. It's 4 weeks of my time to put them in the best possible position so that when I leave there, I feel good about where I am, and they have gotten their value for me staying around for those 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah, to add to that, a couple key points I think are important for other people. I think the communication should always be joint so that people can see that you're in alignment, right? So then there's no questioning of, well, the company doesn't feel that way or Dan doesn't feel that way. The communications should be joint. So when we met with Dan's team, we met together. When we identified key clients and key vendors, we did those meetings together. So we believe that the transition was smooth and that the message was clear, that everything we were saying was a joint message. So that's a tip I think that's important for people to understand.
The other one I would suggest, and I think Dan has already alluded to this, is not only giving 4 or 5 weeks notice, a substantial amount of time given the expanse of the responsibilities being vacated, but also not checking out, actually being fully engaged for that 4 weeks or that 5 weeks. Not, I'm going to turn in my letter and I might perfunctorily show up, but my heart isn't in it anymore. Really being present and being engaged and being invested right up until 5 o'clock on the last day.
That's really important, and Dan really was. I will say, his notes were very thorough, and I have referenced them multiple times since he left to make sure that because there's areas that when you're with the company 20 years, you hope that you're not micromanaging that employee. So there were a lot of areas that Dan was involved in that I really had no idea the extent and the scope. So his notes on those were really helpful. So I agree 100%. If you're leaving an employer on good terms, please be engaged during that last transition process. It will be hugely beneficial, and it'll go a long way towards your legacy with that company really being a positive one.
Yeah, some would say that I worked harder in those last 4 or 5 weeks than I did in the last 4 or 5 years, Dan. Not Angela, she would never say that, but other people.
So one thing I want to get into as we begin to wrap up the podcast, and obviously I don't need to get into any specifics because I realize some of these may be confidential, but separation terms, any kind of agreements associated with separation. I assume there was some kind of a set of terms to which you both agreed without necessarily tipping your hand about exactly what was in any particular contract. Why is it important to have those terms written down and agreed to? And are there any ideas that you might give people who are in a similar circumstance saying, you might want to think about throwing a clause like this in there?
Yeah, so we did have a separation agreement, and being in Dan's role, which was primarily sales, we actually had a yearly compensation plan that he was under. So for us, there already was a structure that we had built, that the separation agreement was modeled after. Roles that aren't sales related typically don't have a yearly compensation plan. So it's really important then to make sure that you negotiate out any terms for that separation agreement. I think the most important thing there is for each party to be reasonable for how they handle that separation agreement, reasonable for compensation and reasonable for other terms that might be in there. It can't all be one-sided, or it's really going to be an unfair agreement across the board. So just be reasonable. I think it's important that you talk it through and listen to each other, and that you can really, then you should be able to come up with something that's legally binding that you can both sleep at night and agree on.
Build off what Angela said, again, it needs to be considered of both parties. And again, a true separation agreement is not necessarily going to be warranted for every scenario. In a case of an executive or a long-standing employee, or in other circumstances that may apply. In this case, you want to make sure that that you're considerate of everybody's expectations, concerns. I'm leaving a company. It's not unheard of for an employee to grab the best and brightest and try to take them with them. I'm sure that was a concern of Angela's. We have great employees at Vistacom, phenomenal employees at Vistacom. I wanted to allay her concerns, whether they were spoken or not, that I had no intention of tearing down this great organization by stealing, some of the best clients. So I was more than happy, to sign a no hire clause or no solicit clause. That never entered my mind not to. But if that gave some peace of mind, that's another example, Dan, where reasonable on both sides, expectation on both sides, come to an agreement that makes sense and that everybody can live by, and then live by it.
Well, I really appreciate you, Dan, and you, Angela, sharing this story. It's one thing for Commercial Integrator and other news media to kind of say top 5 tips and tricks to move on to another company successfully and have it all be completely generic and non-specific. I think it brings it to another level when you're actually sharing an anecdote from 2 people who went through this personally, who still have a very good personal and professional relationship, who respect each other, who did it right, and to be able to glean lessons from that story as opposed to just having them on a blackboard or something like that somewhere. So I appreciate your candor. I appreciate your willingness to share your story. And I do think there are some nuggets here for those in our industry, whether they're doing their personal great reset or they're part of the great resignation, nuggets that they can glean and nuggets that they can benefit from.
Hopefully so is Dan. Yep.
And thank you so much, both of you, for being on the AV Plus podcast today. Really do appreciate you, Dan Gundry, Vice President and Managing Director of VuWall USA with VuWall, and Angela Nolan, who is CEO of Vistacom, which is, of course, Commercial Integrator's 2022 Integrator of the Year. Thank you both for being on the show. My name is Dan Ferrisi, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Integrator and host of the AV Plus podcast. Please check back on commercialintegrator.com each and every Friday for a new edition of AV Plus, the podcast for the commercial AV integration industry. Thank you so much for tuning in.